Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session of Northeastern at noon. Glad to see everyone here. And the topic is about going viral 100 years before Facebook. And on my way over here, it occurred to me that while today's topic focuses on literature and printed texts, in actuality, I think in our experience, we've all seen other things go viral in our lifetime, especially recently. Things like songs or cutesy little animal things on Facebook, and even perhaps clothing styles. And in fact, when I was kind of looking at my own wardrobe here, I noticed what I am wearing, at least in my experience, went viral in the late 50s and early 60s. And I'm wondering if how many of you remember this uniform that us college students wore whenever we had to appear in something that was semi-formal. I have my penny loafers, I have my chinos, I have my blue blazer, which incidentally is still hanging in there, and at least on the campuses I visited, a blue shirt and a maroon tie completed the outfit. But today's topic is much more interesting than my wardrobe, and in fact we have co-presenters. And the first, alphabetically, is Professor Ryan Cordell, who received his PhD in English language and literature in 2010 from the University of Virginia. He's currently assistant professor of English at Northeastern University and a founding faculty member of the NU Lab for Texts, Maps, and Networks. He teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses in American literature, book history, and digital humanities. And in this capacity, he recently received the Outstanding Teacher Award at Northeastern's annual faculty celebration this past April. Among other activities, Professor Cordell is currently a Mellon Fellow of Critical Bibliography at the Rare Book School in Charlottesville, Virginia, and he also serves as Vice President of the Digital Americana Scholarly Society. Now, his present scholarship focuses on convergences among literary, periodical, and religious culture in antebellum American mass media. He's collaborating with colleagues in English, history, and computer science to discover borrowed texts across large-scale archives. I also would like to mention that he's the winner of the 2013 ProQuest Award and most recently received Digital Innovation Fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies. His co-presenter is Professor David Smith. He earned his PhD in computer science at Johns Hopkins University, and he joined the Northeastern faculty from the University of Massachusetts, where he was a research assistant professor in computer science. His research in natural language processing and computational linguistics primarily focuses on building statistical models of human language. His work on applications for information extraction and retrieval, as well as data mining, has been supported by many organizations such as the National Science Foundation and the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. He's also involved in several cross-disciplinary projects at Northeastern, involving colleagues in the humanities and social sciences. And one such project examines reprinting patterns of articles in 19th century American newspapers to detect evidence of political, religious, as well as economic networks. Finally, I have to note that one of his projects that I find rather intriguing is the fact that he is leveraging digital humanities techniques to analyze historic syntactic language changes in an effort to better understand how languages themselves develop. Well, I think we're all interested in what their specific topic for today is where we'll learn not only more about the topic, but I think we'll also get some insight as to how collaborative research actually works. So without further ado, our professors.
Thank you for a wonderful introduction. It's great to see so many people to come out to learn about Facebook before Facebook. Before I get started on the topic for today, I want to say a little bit about the new lab for texts, maps, and networks, which Mr. Hunt has mentioned. So both Ryan and I are founding members as of 3 years ago of this new collaborative research organization that crosses the colleges of computer and information science, social sciences and humanities, and urban policy and communications. And as the name suggests, it's a place for scholars from many different fields to do digital research on texts, maps, and networks. And specifically today, we're interested in networks primarily. So I'll say a little bit about that to start out with. And, again, just as there was Facebook before Facebook, people were interested in this topic before they had computers to be able to actually investigate it. I apologize for that being smaller on this screen than I would like. So, as one does, I was perusing The Economist magazine from 1871. How many people subscribe to The Economist these days? Right. So if you check your back issues from 1871, you'll find the editorial statement that some of the philosophers should turn their attention from the subject of spectroscopic investigations and the invention of electrometers, galvanometers, hygrometers, and so forth to the far more difficult problem of inventing a mode of measuring the intensity and diffusion of political wishes and convictions. So, on the one hand, just as a shallow reading, you could say, well, they wanted people to invent opinion polling back in 1871. But I would also suggest that there are other instruments, the equivalent of spectrometers and hygrometers that we can use to gauge political sentiment or, basically cultural sentiment at large. And that's what a lot of the researchers in the new lab for text, maps, and networks are doing. Right. And basically this has come about because of the large number of what have been called digital breadcrumbs that we're leaving behind us in everything that we do, not just the email or text messages that we know we're sending or the social media posts that we're sending or reading, but also things that implicitly we leave behind us as breadcrumbs. The phone records or web links that we click on in various websites, the searches that we perform, the swipes of our Charlie cards or EasyPass cards, the travel of our license plates through toll booths and so forth. So all of this data that's being collected on us allows us, both researchers and other organizations, advertisers and so forth, to perform interesting new analyses. For instance, some of our colleagues in the new lab looked at instruments like Twitter as evidence for people experiencing earthquakes at varying levels of intensity. They've looked at problems such as, where do political donations come from, and how are those political donations localized in time? So, what events cause people to donate money? They've looked at how political conversations change, not just in our own country, but in this example of the Italian election of 5 years ago, how a heretofore unheard of party came to prominence through the use of social media. And even closer to home, the kinds of social connections that are important both in our day-to-day lives and the kinds of intensely important social connections that people call on in emergencies. So do people call friends on a normal day-to-day basis, but they reach out to family when a traumatic event, as for instance the Boston Marathon bombing of 2 years ago happened? So how who do you call? Who are you going to call? Is the important question there. So, all of the data that we are basically implicitly creating these days has been a prime focus of a lot of research in the social sciences. But today, we're going to primarily talk about a different kind of medium, not as directly mineable as Twitter or Facebook, but that allows us to extend this investigation of digital breadcrumbs farther back into the past.
Okay, so I'm the strange English professor who's interested in computers. And I'm interested in computers because I study 19th century newspapers, and I study the way that information circulated in newspapers. And so in order to talk about that, the first thing we really need to talk about is what is a 19th century newspaper? And the first thing I like to tell people is you can't really think about it in terms of the Boston Globe or the New York Times of today. They were a really different kind of document. They included things that we would recognize as news. This is a report of a speech given in Congress, right? So this is news that would have been reported. They also included things that we would call opinion pieces, right? Here, there are still those who would sell the birthright of our nation's glory for a mess of official pottage. Right? This person is not very happy about what's going on in the government. But they also included a lot of, I joke with my students that sort of tweet-sized news, little very short reports that from around the country, around the state. They also included these things that we could call anecdotes or vignettes. These are, they're stories. They claim to be true, but they have very few details that you could actually go verify. They're the kind of thing that if you got them in a chain email, you would go to a website like Snopes to see if they were real or not. And there's a lot of these in the newspaper. The newspapers also printed fiction. They printed short stories. They printed novels in serial form. They would print a chapter each day or a chapter each week. And almost every newspaper in the 19th century would have printed poetry. And in addition to that, we'll talk about some of the other things they printed today too, but the real point is that the newspaper was a kind of all-purpose medium, right? They were pretty cheap, they were much more affordable than books, and when they came in, people would have expected to get both information and entertainment in their newspaper. The other thing to know about the newspapers is that they operated through what was called the exchange system. So most of these newspapers were being put together by one or two people, right? Every town in the United States pretty much had not one, but at least two newspapers, one for each of the major political parties. So these are partisan newspapers. These are not neutral. There's no idea of journalistic impartiality yet. So it's a Democratic paper or a Republican paper, or it's affiliated with a religious denomination. It's a Baptist paper or a Methodist paper. And the editors would subscribe to newspapers all around the country, and when they came in, first by the mail, eventually by the railroad, then the editor would comb through the other newspapers to look for things that he thought his readers would be interested in, and then he would cut them out and he would reprint them. And this wasn't considered a violation of intellectual property. This was how newspapers operated. And newspapers maintained what they called their exchanges list, which was the list of newspapers that they mailed their paper to, and the newspapers who mailed papers to them, right? And so newspapers are moving all around the country, and editors are borrowing from one another. And I was very interested in how does this work? Who is exchanging with who? What were the pieces that were most widely reprinted? And this is the challenge that I brought to David because it's very difficult to get at. So here is an illustration from Harper's Magazine, kind of typical, it's supposed to be a country newspaper editor's office. There's a farmer coming in trying to pay for his newspaper subscription with some chickens. The editor is deciding whether this is going to work or not. But what I wanted to point out is that on the editor's desk, see, these are columns clipped out of other newspapers that he's considering putting into his own newspaper. And in his trash basket are the columns that he decided he would not be putting in his newspaper, right? And then over here in the corner is the compositor. This is the guy who's actually setting the type, right? So when he finds a piece that he wants in his newspaper, he's going to hand it to his compositor, and his compositor is going to set the type. And when they do that, sometimes they're going to add some content in order to make it fit. Sometimes they're going to take out some content in order to make it fit. Sometimes they're going to change it so that what it says will better fit with their readership, right? So there are all kinds of changes happening as things circulated around the country. So my challenge here, and I'm going to pass it back off to David, was how do we get at this, right? One way that one could get at this would be to sit down and read all of the newspapers. And you are all rolling your eyes appropriately because one can't do that, right? And we also have a challenge. There are these huge digital archives now of newspapers, but in order to find duplicated text, you have to already know what you're looking for. You have to have a search term that you can type in in order to find more. And that's not what I was interested in. I wanted to know what are the things that were widely reprinted at the time that we don't know about anymore, that we've forgotten about, things that went viral but that have been lost. And so this is when I began working with David, and he's going to talk about some of the methods we've used to try and get at this question.
So we began with a study on just the newspapers from the Library of Congress. So it's not all newspapers that existed. It's the ones that the Library of Congress had digitized so far. And just the newspapers from 1860 and before, roughly the antebellum newspapers. Since I made up these examples, we've expanded our investigations to later in the 19th century, but I'm presenting these early results today. And so in that initial set from the Library of Congress, there were 41,829 issues of 132 different newspapers. And all that we have are these images of text and transcriptions from the beginning of the issue to the end. So you don't know anything about the Library of Congress digitizing crews didn't have article breaks inserted. You just had one single flow of text. And that's not, necessarily the liability that you might think for the reasons that Ryan just stated, right? That the compositors in different newspapers might expand or contract the original article. So we wouldn't necessarily expect the reprinting just to be lined up with the article breaks. And what we'd like to do is to be able to find a passage in one newspaper that aligns well to a passage in the other. And so discover those passages that align well to passages in the other, find passages in that newspaper that align well to passages in the other newspaper, and so forth, right? So for all of these pairs of newspapers. And then to find those passages that are sufficiently similar that they should be grouped together in a bigger cluster, right? Here are all the reprintings of some text that we didn't know about, or some text that we did. Of course, the slight hitch here is that in 41,829 newspapers, we might have to do 874 million different alignments, which, even if you have a computer, is not very tractable, especially we're dealing with entire collections. And it's worse than that, right? We don't just want to align newspapers, we want to find the well-aligned passages in the newspapers. And I'll illustrate that graphically here. Right, so say that you have the entire text of this newspaper, the Journal Extra, the entire text of this newspaper, the Jeffersonian, and we believe that there is some text somewhere within the Jeffersonian that aligns well with the Journal Extra. The other way of saying that is that there's some, the rest of the newspaper that, doesn't share this text is completely unaligned. So there's this little region in here whose boundaries we don't know, right, that aligns well, and we need to exclude all the other material. And that's not the only problem. There is going to be a lot of repeated text in this collection, which is not of interest for the kinds of literary investigations that Ryan has described, right? There's a lot of reprinting that just has to do with the masthead being repeated from one paper to the other, or some advertising campaign, either in several issues of the same newspaper or issues of different newspapers as national advertising campaigns take hold. That's not to say that there couldn't be some interesting investigations of advertising in the 19th century. It's just not what we're currently interested in this project. Or various pieces of legal boilerplate, or other things like that. So we're not, and then there's a final problem, which is that the text the Library of Congress gives us looks like this. Right? This is the result of optical character recognition transcriptions of those images, which, to be honest, are microfilms. So if you photograph them, directly, you might get a higher resolution than if you microfilmed them back in the 1960s or 70s and then photograph the microfilm, which is how we actually got this data to begin with. So, trust me that this passage is something about Henry Clay from a Vermont newspaper from 1845, right? A number of friends which united on Mr. Clay a few days since, et cetera, et cetera. So the underlying text is not very reliable either. So what are we going to do? So we want to, at a high level, detect the approximate set of newspaper pairs that might contain some overlapping text, and then approximately find the alignment between those pairs that we've selected, and then approximately merge those different aligned pairs together into larger clusters. So we don't just know that the same text occurred in 2 newspapers, but that some substantially similar text occurred across a cluster of 20 or 50 or 100 newspapers. So how does this work? So let's just start with a little toy collection of 3 passages from 3 different newspapers, as transcribed by optical character recognition from the Library of Congress, with warts and all of the errors in it. Document 1: Her Majesty dares to congratulate the President upon the successful completion of this great intern 1 Lion's work. And so forth. So these are all selections from stories about the completion of the first transatlantic telegraph cable in 1859, where Queen Victoria, had a message telegraphed to James Buchanan. Right. So three different documents, 3 different instances of that. And we're going to break up these texts into smaller features that we hope will give us a more robust signal as to what matches what. And we're going to use what computational linguists call n-grams. In this case, sequences of n contiguous words. So if we were to build an index of 5 grams, for example, we would slide a window across each one of these texts that is 5 words wide. And say, okay, the 5 gram Her Majesty dares to congratulate appears in document 1. The 5 gram Majesty dares to congratulate the appears in document 1. Dares to congratulate the President appears in document 1. And so on through documents 2 and 3. Right? If we had fewer OCR errors, we could hope to find matches of longer n-grams, but 5 seems to work pretty well, even with all the errors that we're dealing with in these newspapers. So once we have that list of n-grams, the thing you'll observe is that some of the n-grams reoccur in 2 or more different documents. So for instance, to congratulate the President upon appears in both documents 1 and 3. Whereas congratulate the President upon the occurs in documents 1 and 3, and upon the successful completion of occurs in documents 1 and 2, but not in 1 and 3 because of the error. Right. And the other thing to note here is that we can already get some savings because we're only interested in reprinted texts. So if an n-gram only occurs in 1 document, we can ignore it. From now on in subsequent processing. If it doesn't occur more than once, it's not useful evidence for reprinting. Then we'll take this index of n-grams and reshuffle it instead of organizing things as in, so how many people have used concordance to the Bible or Shakespeare or something like that, right? So yes, so this organization, which computer scientists sometimes call an inverted index and normal people call a concordance, lists things in the order, in alphabetical order by the shared passages. And we're going to reverse it. We're going to list things by all of the possible pairs that each n-gram occurs in, right? So documents 1 and 2 share the n-gram upon the successful completion of. Documents 1 and 3 share these 2 5 grams, congratulate the President upon and upon the successful completion of. And again, we can prune n-grams that occur in far too many documents to help us discriminate reprinted texts. So performing only this n-gram indexing step already gets us a big savings. Instead of comparing 875 million pairs of newspaper issues, we can get down to comparing only 15 million pairs, which is now within the compass of our current computing ability. So we're comparing less than 1% of the pairs that we feared we would have to. Okay, so now we know that this pair of newspapers might contain a reprinted text. How do we find that text and ignore all of the stuff that isn't actually related to each other? And we're going to use an algorithm that's sometimes called sequence alignment or edit distance computations. And it was originally developed in areas like code breaking and machine translation to align words that might be related to each other. So here's a simple example of trying to find a cognate between French, couleur, and the word color in the British spelling. And we can view that as a path through this two-dimensional chart, as it's called, where you line up all the letters of one word along the horizontal, you line up all the letters of the other word along the diagonal, and you try and find a path from the upper left to the lower right that goes through as many matching cells of the grid as possible. There's one mismatch where that E turns into O. And although the path is short, the number of possible paths is still exponential. But fortunately, in the 1950s, Edsger Dijkstra, and in the 1960s, Vladimir Levenstein developed a set of algorithms that basically said, oh, look, this is just shortest path routing through this chart. This is the algorithm that your GPS uses to figure out which roads you should take, depending where all of the sections of road are assigned costs based on average travel time and distance and so forth. And Levenstein realized that you could apply Dijkstra's algorithm to finding the distance between words. And so instead of searching all of the exponentially many ways to get through, you could just do it in quadratic time. So just the square of the cells. So we need to make a few slight adjustments to this. We don't want to go all the way from the upper left to the lower right. We just want some little path in the middle, and we need to make another adjustment where even doing this operation is too costly, right? So if one issue is 144,000 characters long and the other newspaper issue is 131 characters long, we don't want to actually allocate 18 billion or 19 billion cells in our chart. So we need to make a further approximation again, and we use all the n-grams that we detected in the previous step to give us some anchor points that any alignment must go through, and that cuts it down to just these little blocks. So what the engineers would call a block matrix instead of the full dense matrix. And that allows us to end up with something like this. This is actually an example not from 19th century newspapers, but from versions of congressional bills that we aligned, where all of the matching characters are printed here, but if a word such as general is inserted in one text and not in the other, we show where the gaps are. And if you have lots and lots of texts that are aligned, you can line them up in columns using methods from computational biology for aligning gene sequences. See, all the different versions of some article about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Okay, so we've aligned the passages in different newspapers, and then we group all of these line passages together to get something that looks like this. Basically, the clusters of all the different versions of, say, James Buchanan's State of the Union speech. Before Woodrow Wilson's State of the Union speeches occurred in December instead of in January. So despite all of the OCR errors, such as since our last meat log, the country has been eminently prosperous, we're still able to link these texts together. Or, for instance, different versions of a short story by popular temperance writer T.S. Arthur. And so we also, throughout this process, keep track of the original sources, so we can see what the transcription looked like on the original page, just so we're not fully dependent on the OCR when we hand this data back to the scholars of English who want to actually look at the data. So, Ryan will.
Okay, so you can see why I was really thrilled to begin working with David, right? Because this is a really intractable problem for me, and it became very tractable. Before I jump into some of the stuff, the sort of actual text that we're finding, I just want to talk about another one of the real benefits of looking at newspapers from such a wide view. So we, looking at the 19th century, using the methods that David's developed, we've identified about 1.7 million groups of reprinted texts from the Library of Congress's database. Now, some of those groups are very small, 2 or 3 reprints, but quite a few of them are really large. They're showing us texts that were reprinted in a third of the newspapers in the country. So again, really getting at what I was interested in, like what were the viral things from the 19th century. The other thing that such an approach allows us to do is to use that reprinting data to try and suss out which newspapers were the most influential newspapers during the period. So this is what's called a network graph. You may have seen these before to talk about social media, to talk about Twitter or Facebook or something like that. But here, the circles in the graph are individual newspapers, and they're sized based on how many texts they print that other newspapers reprint, right? So how they're operating as information brokers. And the lines between these newspapers indicate shared reprints between particular newspapers. So we can begin to suss out which newspapers were likely to have had a kind of exchange relationship based on how many reprinted texts we've identified between them. So in this graph, even those very, very thin lines represent a few hundred shared reprints, and these very thick lines represent tens of thousands of shared reprints between two newspapers. And in some cases, these connections have allowed us to go back into the actual archive and identify interesting characteristics. In one instance, we saw a very strong connection between a newspaper up in Vermont and a newspaper in Missouri. And the thing to remember is that Missouri is the kind of western edge of the country in the 19th century, at least in the early period. And so I asked Abby Mullen, who's a history student who's working on the project, to go figure out what was going on. And she spent a little bit of time in the archive and discovered that the editors of these two newspapers were brothers-in-law. And so the graph showed us a strong relationship that then we were able to bear out looking at the newspapers themselves. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about then is what are we finding? So if someone trained in literary studies, trained to study fiction and poetry, I'm finding myself wrestling with really different kinds of texts when I think about popular reading and writing during the period. And so what I want to talk about a little bit is just what are the kinds of things that went viral in the 19th century. One of the things that went viral, there's a lot of what we would identify as kind of travel narratives, right? Keep in mind, people don't get to travel as widely in the 19th century. It takes a lot longer to go places. People are very hungry for information about the world. And so here we have interesting extracts from the far-off country of Norway, seeing the sun at midnight, desirable immigrants for the United States. So it's a whole account of traveling through Norway, and this was, as you can see, reprinted in at least 79 newspapers, which is about a fifth of the newspapers in our corpus. And we have a lot of these, accounts of places in Europe, accounts of places in the East, accounts of places all over. Lots of sort of cures and home remedies, right? A cure for the smallpox. So if you're suffering from smallpox, I've got a cure for you. I can send you this. And we have other sorts of like home remedies for diseases that were very common at the time, and other kinds of material about the home. You'll see some of that here in a minute. What I would identify as sort of scientific extracts. This, called Concerning Man, is really an account of, how many muscles are there in the body, how much blood is in the body. It's a kind of description of the physical characteristics of people. And we're finding a lot of scientific articles reprinted. And actually, recently, we've also included some 19th century magazines in our study. And we found that the magazine that seems to be most closely aligned with the newspapers is Scientific American, right, which begins during this period, and newspapers are reprinting just a ton of information from Scientific American. And so these kinds of informational materials are very popular. I often, when I go through these, I ask people to imagine their own, if you have social media accounts, imagine your own Facebook page, imagine your own Twitter feed. And I actually think there's some interesting comparisons to be made between the kinds of things that widely circulated then and now. They're not perfect comparisons, but there are some interesting corollaries. Many, many, many sort of inspirational or religious exhortations, right? So here, a beautiful reflection. It cannot be that earth is man's abiding place. It cannot be that our life is cast up by the ocean of uncertainty. This is just a kind of a reflection on immortality, on life after death. And we find a lot of these sort of very short kinds of things. And one thing that we know about these extracts is that 19th century readers saved them. They would cut them out and they would put them in their scrapbooks. Scrapbooking was a very popular activity during the 19th century. There are scholars who have really studied 19th century scrapbooking practices. But what was often in the scrapbooks would be pieces like this from the newspaper that people would cut out and save. So we have newspaper editors cutting things out. We have newspaper readers cutting things out, right? These texts are just circulating all through. So we have here, this is a story, this is a temperance story. People often forget that temperance, was the largest reform movement of the 19th century. It was far larger than abolition or any of the movements we tend to think about in terms of popularity. It was popular through the entire century and eventually leads to prohibition. But lots and lots of temperance stories. This is a kind of anecdote of a young man who's destroyed by drink that was, as you see, reprinted in at least 64 newspapers. Lots of, again, what I would call anecdotes or vignettes, these things that sort of purport to be true stories, but that you could never look up or actually verify. In this case, this is a story of a young man who woos a young woman in church by circling verses in the Bible and passing them to her, and the verses are laden with meaning about his intentions towards her. And so it purports to be a true story of this thing that happened, but it doesn't give you any names or like an actual location or any of the kinds of things you would need to see if this really did happen. It reads like fiction. Here, more popular science. If you need a recipe for paste that will keep for an entire year, again, I have a recipe for you. One thing that was really surprising to me was the degree to which just trivia is so popular in these columns. So here we have facts worth noting, and it's really just a list of how many languages are in the world, demographic facts about the world, how many people belong to different religions. Tall men live longer than short ones. Women have more chances of life in their favor previous to being 50 than men have. I mean, it's really just this sort of, in some reprints of this, it's attributed to a gentleman claiming to be a friend of the human race. I'm really fascinated by the degree to which just this informational content was so popular in the newspaper. Lots of recipes, focus on like home, culinary practices. In this case, the properties of the tomato. This is an article that is attributed to a doctor, medical doctor, and the first thing that it wants to convince readers of is that tomatoes are not poisonous. Right? There was a popular idea that the skin of the tomato was poisonous, and so they're trying to dispel that myth, and then it moves from there into recipes that it claims will make the tomato not disgusting, basically. The tomato's not really a part of the American diet at this period. It's so pervasive now that it's hard to imagine, but they were fairly new to the American palate at this moment. So this is again, reprinted in at least 81 newspapers. So now we're getting closer to a quarter of the newspapers in our study that this was printed in. And this one's hard to read, but the other thing that I've been very surprised with is the preeminence of lists in the 19th century newspaper. We tend to think of the list as a kind of internet genre. There are these websites like BuzzFeed that are famous for what are called listicles, which are articles in list form, right? 27 reasons why living in Boston is the best thing in the world, like that kind of thing. And these are everywhere in the popular material that we're uncovering in 19th century newspapers. So here, this is a list of supposed follies about personal health. Basically, things people believe about their personal health that the article is claiming are not true. To think that the more a man eats, the fatter and stronger he will become. To believe that the more hours children study in school, the faster they learn. To conclude that if exercise is good for the health, the more violent and exhausting it is, the more good is done, right? And this list, it changed a lot. Like certain items were added, certain items were taken away as it circulated around the country. But we're just finding so many of these lists. And then, of course, poetry, right? When I talk to this with students, I say you have to remember this is before the advent of recorded sound, right? That comes later in this century. And the poetry column in the newspaper is not unlike the sort of music video pasted into Facebook, right? Many of these poems were themselves widely reprinted in the poetry corner of particular newspapers. This is What I Live For. It's another sort of inspirational poem about the sort of the grand meaning of life. But the poems were also excerpted into other kinds of documents. This one in particular is excerpted into sermons. It's excerpted into pledges. In this case, it's excerpted into an appropriate pledge prepared and proposed for every Southern volunteer at the beginning of the Civil War. So this is a newspaper in Virginia that's trying to propose this sort of pledge of loyalty that Confederate soldiers would take when they entered the Army, and they use a portion of this widely reprinted poem. And so here we're getting at the ways that these things circulate through other media. And many of these poems were also set to music, and one can find the sheet music for them if you search. And in some cases, the poem in the newspaper would have a line above it that would say, "to be sung to the tune of," and then it would give a popular song. So even in the newspapers, there's a kind of musical quality to the poetry that was popular and that was reprinted. And so this is the sheet music from the 19th century of that poem I was just showing you. So the other thing that I've been really interested in is, as these things were moving around the country, how did people sort of recognize them, or where did they think they came from? And what did they think about who wrote them, right? And it gets really interesting. We've been working lately on what was called in the newspapers fugitive poetry. And fugitive poetry were these poems that were circulating either without an author's name attached to them, so they were anonymously authored, or sometimes poems where the newspapers were actually fighting about who the right author was. There was a debate happening about who wrote these things. So here we have a poem, a fugitive poem that many authors claim. And what's really interesting to me is to see the way editors are even aware of these fights that are happening. It's not that they're just putting the wrong names in and forgetting about it. They know that these are debates. So there's a few that I find interesting that I'll talk about really quickly. The first one, the Lincoln Bump. So there's a poem by William Knox. He's a Scottish poet. It's called Mortality. And it was first published in the 1830s. It was published in a book that Knox published. But it really wasn't all that popular. It circulated a little bit in newspapers, but it wasn't a widely popular poem. Until the 1860s, when we get a little narrative attached to the poem, we see the following in a contemporary credited as the composition of Abraham Lincoln, Esquire of Illinois, now President of the United States. So some newspapers begin saying this poem was written by Abraham Lincoln. We know that's not true, but they begin claiming it. While others, and I know this one really can't be read, and this was the more popular myth, begin saying that this was a really favorite poem of Lincoln's. And in fact, there's a story that begins to grow up that says that when Lincoln was having his portrait sketched for that portrait of the Emancipation Proclamation, that he recited this poem to heart, from his heart, to the painter. And this story begins circulating basically right after Lincoln's assassination, right? And the poem is all about mortality and sort of being comfortable with death. And so this poem gets attached to Lincoln, not to its original author, and becomes very popular sort of on the back of Lincoln's fame, and also on the back of the sort of national grieving that's happening because Lincoln has been assassinated. And what I find really fascinating is that myth persists. And in fact, if you look at William Knox's Wikipedia page, it's a very short Wikipedia page. It has only maybe 10 sentences in the entire entry. The second sentence, he is known for writing Abraham Lincoln's favorite poem, Mortality, which Lincoln often recited from memory. And I should emphasize that I don't actually know that that's true. I think it's a myth created by the newspapers, but we see it reflected all the way to today, where poor William Knox is known far more for his connection with Lincoln than for his actual poetry, right? We have another interesting example. This poem, even if you took 19th century literature classes, I suspect you've never read this poem. When the lessons and tasks are all ended and school for the day is dismissed, and the little ones gather around me to bid me good night and be kissed. So basically, I mean, this is how my classes end, right? All my students gather around me. But this is an incredibly popular poem in the 19th century. It's widely reprinted. It's praised as one of the best poems in the English language. But what's very interesting is when it's originally printed, it's printed as by the village schoolmaster or by its actual author, who is the New York poet Charles M. Dickinson. Now, you might be seeing where this is going already, because very soon it becomes The Children by Charles Dickens, who is, of course, one of the most famous writers in the world in the 19th century, and in fact, probably the most popular novelist in America at the time. And I'm going to skip by that because you can't really see it. And eventually, it gets cited as by the late Charles Dickens, after Dickens passes away. And then the myth that really, really begins to hang on to this poem is that they begin saying that this poem was found among the papers of Charles Dickens after his death. Right? So now there's a mystery attached to this poem. Not only is it by the famous novelist Charles Dickens, but we found it in his desk after he passed away. And of course, this is untrue. And Charles M. Dickinson spends his entire very long career trying to convince people that he actually is the author of this poem. And he publishes a book of his poetry in the 1880s and reprints a letter from Charles Dickens' son in the introduction of that book, where he says, my father did not write this poem. We did not find it in his desk after he died. But still, people kept printing it as Dickens' poem. The last one I was going to talk about just really briefly is even more complicated. So this is a poem. It's called Beautiful Snow, most often, although in some instances it's called Once I Was Pure. And it's a very typically dark 19th century poem in which a woman who has sort of fallen from grace is looking at the snow as it falls and thinking, I was once pure as the snow is pure. And sort of in a final morbid reflection, she decides that she will be pure again when she's buried beneath the snow. If you've read 19th century literature, it's typically dark in this way, or often dark in this way. So this is an incredibly popular poem that no one knew who wrote. And it was attributed to a lot of people, and in fact, editors fought over who the actual author of this was. You see this paragraph here before the poem starts. As this poem circulates around the country, the prose before the poem eventually becomes far longer than the poem itself. As editors debate, no, you said it was this person, but I know it was actually this person. So some people said that it was written by an actress, a famous actress who had fallen from wealth. And sometimes they named that actress as this woman, Dora Shaw, who was a very famous actress during the 19th century, eventually friends with Walt Whitman and some of his bohemian club in New York. Others attribute it to William Sigourney, who was a sort of literary man, and this particular story said that his wife had been unfaithful to him, and then he had written this poem as a retaliation against her. So this is one version of the story. Another version of the story says that it was actually written by Henry Faxon, who is a prominent newspaper editor. This is the least enticing of all the different stories. They just said, no, it was really Henry Faxon, and I pretty much left it at that. But the most popular myth of this story's composition said that it had been found after the death of an anonymous prostitute in a hospital in Cincinnati during the Civil War. And this is the citation that really takes off. But we know it's not true because the poem began circulating well before the Civil War, right? But this is the version that people really sunk their teeth into. And as it circulates, and here we can see this okay, you can see that it begins as an anonymous poem, right? And then eventually, people began to add names to it. Get to where the first name is. There we go. We've got some Dora Shaws now appearing. People are talking about it. Oh, there's Henry Faxon. Some more Henry Faxon. There's our Cincinnati prostitute. William Sigourney. William Sigourney. But you're going to see that the narrative of the Cincinnati prostitute begins to sort of take over. And we've actually graphed this out, and about twice as many people attribute it to this unnamed prostitute as to any of these other people. And actually, the person who probably did write it is someone who doesn't really even appear in these accounts. Okay, so this is what I've been interested in, and I was turn to David for some final thoughts on other applications to this method we've been developing.
Yeah, so I'll just be brief. The techniques that we've developed to look at 19th century newspapers, fortunately, are not only useful for investigating the literary culture of the 19th century, but for looking at literary culture more generally. For instance, analyzing what parts of earlier literature are, become more or less popular over time. So this is actually what, Ryan said we did not want to do. We don't want to, take one document that we know is popular. We want to know what things we didn't know about. But it turns out that, figuring out what parts of various plays of Shakespeare or other canonical texts were popular over time is an interesting task, right? Turns out that, Polonius's advice speech, for instance, is particularly popular, as well as the to be or not to be soliloquy. We can apply this to even earlier literary texts before print, in fact, manuscript cultures, to look at how information circulated in the manuscript culture of, for instance, the Islamic world. So working with Maxime Romanoff and Sarah Savant on that project. And then finally, closer to the present day, as I alluded to, we've been using these techniques to analyze how influence circulates through policy networks in Congress and other legislatures, state legislatures as well. So primarily, people look at the influence of politicians through whether their bills pass. Do you have the votes to pass this measure? And that's a useful metric. It's uncontroversial, right? They take roll calls most of the time to see who votes for what. But it turns out that that's leaving a lot of information on the table. If you actually look at the text of the measures being voted on, you can find out a lot more. So a prime example of that is, for instance, in the Affordable Care Act, which this is a graph of, it turns out that a lot of the sections in the Affordable Care Act have language that originally appeared in Republican bills, even though no Republicans voted for the eventual measure. So, for instance, the largest such portion of that, this dot here, was a bill that Senator Charles Grassley, a Republican of Iowa, had been trying to get enacted for the previous 10 years, basically reforming the nursing home care system and the process of funding nursing home care through Medicaid. And he finally got that measure enacted by getting that language inserted into the Affordable Care Act, but then voted against the eventual act. So if we look at the actual text itself, we can find out more about whose policies are being advanced by legislation. And then we can also look at various state legislatures to see, well, how do policies spread throughout the country as well. And we're also currently looking at some European legislation. So I guess the note that I want to close on is that mostly we've been talking about texts. That's what my work is primarily concerned with, analyzing written language. Ryan's work and training have primarily been about the analysis of written texts, and we've been talking about methods for looking at the connections among texts. But I would argue that just as with social media, our interests are primarily in finding out what texts tell us about the connections among people. And instead of studying social networks by looking at direct links, who is friends with whom on Facebook, who retweets whose tweets, we're able to do this even when those links aren't explicit, but implicitly inferred from the evidence of texts, even as far back as the antebellum United States. So we'd like to thank our sponsors and our colleagues at the New Lab, and we're happy to take questions. Thank you very much. Yes.
All right, so the question is, well, when did the format of newspapers change? So there are different formats during the 19th century. You have newspapers that have daily editions, weekly editions. Some of the bigger newspapers would have had daily editions, and then on the weekend they would have put together a kind of omnibus that would have reprinted actually a lot from the weekly edition. But in general, during the 19th century, what we're looking at are 4-page papers. So they're printed literally on one big sheet, page 1 and page 4 on one side, pages 2 and 3 on the inside, and then it's folded once, right? And that's partly economic. It's partly, again, because most of these newspapers are being run by very small staffs. And most of the newspapers, people did not go to school to train to be a journalist, right? Most of these newspapers are run by political operatives. The Democratic Party said, we don't have a paper in this town, go start a Democratic paper in this town. And they would go and start a paper. During the later 19th century and the early 20th century is when we begin to get the sort of modern idea of journalism emerging, right? Begin to get sort of professionalization of the field. Ideas that we tend to associate with newspapers now, like journalistic impartiality, begin to emerge as a response to sort of yellow dog journalism in the late 19th century, right? And you begin to see the emergence of some of these bigger newspapers like we imagine today. I mean, one thing to keep in mind, New York had a ton of newspapers during the 19th century. A lot of these began to merge or fall away until, big cities would tend to have a few big newspapers rather than a lot of little newspapers. So it's really late 19th century, but really the early 20th century before we begin to see newspapers, with multiple sections, the sort of big, giant things that we imagine, being plopped on the doorstep. Yeah.
I was just going to say, too, at the same time, communication was developing and entertainment forms were changing. More specialized magazines and things started to come out. The printing methods became better so that they could print out, big magazines of poetry and stories. And so probably they shifted away from a lot of that. A lot was going on in the world. They could find out about it more. They had stories to tell about farther away, coming over the wire, coming over other new forms of communication that were spreading. So that probably had something to do with it too. They had to change because the world was developing.
Yeah, so in general, the question then is about the relationship between changes in the newspaper and changes in technology or media. One of the reasons why there's this huge explosion of newspapers is technological. So there are a few things that happen in the early 19th century. The first is that the steam press is invented, right? So newspapers could be produced not on the hand press, but on a machine that would print thousands of sheets in an hour. That makes printing technology dramatically cheaper. The other thing that happens, and this is a little bit less exciting, but it's just as important, is that we begin to develop much cheaper forms of paper. In particular, paper derived from wood pulp rather than from fabric. And actually, this makes possible a huge expansion of print material in the 19th century. And then that wood pulp paper gets even sort of cheaper to produce as the century progresses. In the hand press period, the most expensive thing for printing was the paper, by far. And so when paper gets cheaper, all of a sudden, so Ben Franklin in his autobiography talks about there being, I believe it's maybe 100 newspapers in the United States. Someone will check my exact numbers on the webcast. But by the 1830s, we have tens of thousands of newspapers. It's an order of magnitude larger, which is why they have to exchange, basically. There's suddenly a huge number of newspapers being run by only a few people apiece, right? And then, as that technology gets cheaper through the 19th century, as the telegraph becomes more and more important, then these kinds of exchange do change a little. Although when we started talking about the whole 19th century, I thought that the telegraph was going to just sort of change everything, that the exchange would be completely changed by the telegraph. What seems to be true is that certain kinds of news becomes telegraph news. So we get these clusters where, a third of the newspapers in the country print the same story in 2 days, right? This is clearly something that went out via telegraph. But that doesn't seem to be true of the majority of the text. It seems like most of them are still coming through the mail. The things that are a little bit less urgent and timely, the poetry, the recipes, those sorts of things.
Have you thought about extending your political applications to pending legislation to see if various versions of the bill have things in common, or it might be kind of compromise of the weak?
Yes, in fact, so actually this, thank you, oh, sorry, yes. The question was about whether we're looking at pending legislation as well as enrolled legislation or laws. Yeah, and the answer is actually that figure does show all versions of legislation, so both passed and unpassed, which if you only look at passed legislation, you're only looking at 2% of bills, because 98% of bills fail. Both the earlier versions of bills that didn't pass and bills that are unrelated to anything that passed that just don't go anywhere for years, right? So some representative could be trying to enact some bill for many years, and then it eventually, as often happens, gets incorporated into one of these omnibus bills. Say you're somebody in Oregon who's trying to control the spread of meth, and you've been trying, and then you have this bright idea, oh, I'll get it inserted into the Patriot Act reauthorization. Right, so again, it looks like Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin is passing this meth control legislation, whereas actually it was Henley, representative of Oregon, who's been, pushing this idea for years.
Is it possible to do that on a real-time basis and provide that information to legislators?
That might be possible as well. So currently, I'm collaborating with somebody who worked on the Thomas legislative information system. And actually, on a local level, one of the graduate students who did some work on the project a couple of years ago now works at the Massachusetts State House. And my cunning plan is that we can encourage him to use some of this technology there. And there's a question back.
That was kind of my question. Now we've seen a great example of how you've used the English department in your lab. Can you give us an idea of some of the other projects that are going on from different departments?
Yeah, so the question was about other projects that are going on in the new lab. So I mentioned a couple of them. Our colleague in political science, David Lazar, primarily works on political networks specifically. He looks more at issues of campaign contributions as well as political persuasion. Which is, there's some interesting issues around that, right? So, for instance, he had a recent paper out about, the strangely counterintuitive notion that Congress people talking to their constituents might persuade them. So it's something that people didn't believe might actually be true. Of course, the devil is in the details, right? The devil is in, what kinds of conversation you had. And so they ran controlled experiments where they randomly selected constituents to come in and talk with a congressman about various issues and, measure changes in political opinions. We have a colleague, Ben Schmidt, in history, who has done a lot of work on visualizing the change of language over time. So this can be sort of broad-scale things, such as he worked with the Google Books data, looking at the rise and fall of various vocabulary. He has a popular sideline in critiquing linguistic anachronisms in historical drama. So, for instance, he got a lot of press for pointing out anachronous words in Downton Abbey. Right, that word was, the episode was in 1918, but that word didn't come into circulation until 1933. Right, as well as doing some very interesting work with whaling ship logs. We have colleagues, Brooke Foucault-Wells and Christo Wilson, who look at issues of communication online and the so-called filter bubble. Right, so as internet search companies see what you've read before, they are going to show you more of what you have read before, and thus you're seeing less of the kinds of things that you didn't read before but might still be interested in. And the related commercial topic of if you've seen Christo's work on price discrimination, which is a perfectly respectable term in economics and business, although it sounds bad, right? It means people who are willing to pay more might be charged more. See airline tickets. Right? And it turns out that this happens online as well. So the crude version of this 10 years ago was that certain online retailers would notice that your browser was on a Mac and charge you more because Macs cost more. Right. Are there other interesting projects going? Our marathon project.
Yeah, so we've done on the sort of history and lit side, we have a few other sorts of projects. I mean, the New Lab is a very interesting gathering of people who are interested in data, conceived very broadly, whether that's historical data or modern data, and sort of how we interact with that data, right? So after the Boston Marathon bombings in 2013, I and a few of my colleagues put together what came to be called Our Marathon, which is an archive that the community could contribute to. And what we asked people to contribute were their stories, like where were you, what did you experience, the images, video, basically anything, as a way of constructing a kind of memorial in real time. For the city. And that was a very interesting project. We worked with WBUR. We recorded some oral histories that ran in part on WBUR. We ended up working with the City of Boston Archives to digitize a lot of letters and cards that had been sent to the city from around the world. That project's sort of wrapping up now. We're beginning to turn it over to the Northeastern Archives, but that's one of the projects we ran through the new lab. And most excitingly, that got a lot of our graduate students sort of took leadership of various parts of that project and really gained some enormous experience from different departments. Just very briefly, my colleague Elizabeth Maddock Dillon is putting together an archive of text related to the Caribbean. the early Caribbean, which is an area where there is a lot of material. Not much of it is collected or available online. And so they're working to put together a kind of comprehensive archive of early Caribbean materials. And I feel like I'm missing something. Oh, I'm sorry, yes. And then another colleague, Julia Flanders, actually runs one of the largest archives of women's writing in the world from the early modern period through the 19th century, and has been running this project for about 25 years now, building up this incredible archive, and also developing standards for how do we represent scholarly texts online, which is an interesting problem in its own right. So we have a huge range of projects and people at the New Lab, yeah.
Can you search for editorials or articles by subject matter? For example, every older generation has something to say about the younger generation, and you can put a quote up, and it turns out it's from 1820, but it says what someone would say today. Can you find that kind of strain?
Sure. Thanks. So the question was, can we search for these reprinted texts by subject matter, for instance, the old complaining about the young? So the first thing to say is that you're absolutely right, there's a lot of that in there. The bad news currently is that because we're discovering these texts in this bottom-up manner, we don't have the labor to label these texts to catalog these texts by hand. I mean, incidentally, it's worth pointing out, right, that librarians catalog books, but even if the book is a journal that contains a lot of different articles, librarians don't even go there, let alone the level of individual articles in newspapers. So everything that we've done so far has to be done automatically, which means that it's not quite as nice as somebody interested in this data would wish. So, but I can tell you what we have done, which is. And actually, to be fair, right, we thought when we started this project we would do exactly this, right, that there would be students, graduate students in the English department who would get interested in a certain kind of literature. Well, okay, they wouldn't have to read all the newspapers, that's the good news, but they would, they could read a lot of the reprints and at least catalog them. No, there's still, 1.7 million clusters, as Ryan mentioned, so still too many clusters, even if you filter out all the non-reprinted stuff. Okay, so what can we do? We've been, you can search on keywords in the database, right? So you could look for, the young or, an aged citizen has written it, right? If you find some keywords or some text that you think might characterize this genre, you could start a search process and try and, build up, what are the kinds of words that occur in this genre of the old complaining about the young? And that might take a little while. The other thing that we're working on is being able to build these models of genre automatically. So tag a few of these articles, old complaining about the young, wives playing jokes on their husbands, interesting facts about Norway, poetry about Abraham Lincoln. And use those examples to train a classifier. Right, so this is the kind of thing that basically Google News uses to categorize all of the news articles in the world. Right, so Google News is organized automatically by saying, aha, here's one article about the latest Department of Labor unemployment report, and so I observe all of the terms that are in that article, and I search for other articles that have similar terms in similar proportions. So again, it's still somewhat supervised. We have to have the humans figuring out what genres are interesting to detect, but then we can get at least some generalization. You don't have to find all of the instances of that genre automatically. You can use automatic text categorization to try and expand on your initial set, once you've found them, which again is the problem.
One last question, please.
Did you or your linguist colleagues have any interesting observations about the changes in English during your search period, the previous 2 centuries ago, as you looked at the two-man newspapers and the reprints and exchanges and so forth? Did you see any interesting developments in use of language?
So the question was, do we see any interesting developments over time, over the period we've studied in language? That is a very interesting question. We are currently working on it, but I don't have any, great, overarching theoretical results to report. Partly because a lot of the signal we're looking at is so noisy because of the OCR. The good news is we not only have historical data, but we also have the geographic data as well. So you could see potentially see differences in language in different parts of the country. The one thing, besides just the fact that individual vocabulary words for technologies or slang terms might rise and fall over time, the one thing that seems most obvious to us now, looking at the data, are changes in the kinds of arguments that verbs can take. Right. So, the technical term meaning. So, does a verb take a direct object, or does it take a preposition which governs the object of the verb? Right. So, a good example of that is even in my lifetime. When I was in high school, we said I graduated from high school, but kids today say they graduated high school or graduated Northeastern. Of course, my grandmother told me that was incorrect, that high school graduated you. It's like, Yakov Smirnov in Soviet Russia, high school graduates you. So that's an example of change in the argument structure of verbs, right? Where do the subjects and objects go? And that's the primary phenomenon we're investigating. But there's plenty of other interest in this data also because we have not only time, but geography.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to add that I am really looking forward to any efforts that you undertake to analyze the Northeastern news from 1898 and onward. But in the meantime, we have a little token of appreciation for you. And once again, fantastically interesting subject matter and research results. And will you be available just for a few minutes after if there are any more questions? Yes, indeed, that's very nice. Thank you very much. I do have a couple of, I guess, what you'd call administrative announcements. First is that the Boston Harbor Lunch Cruise is sold out. There are probably tickets available, a small number of them, for our other scheduled events. So if you're changing your mind and decide you may want to attend one of those, please do not delay. Finally, please do not delay on filling out any of our surveys, which you'll see scattered about on these tables. The purpose of these surveys is to get any ideas you may have for future Northeastern at Noon events or presentations. The committee has already started to think about our fall presentations and field trips, so it is not too early to start letting us know what your thoughts are. Finally, I have already had 2 snacks, so you know I have no willpower, but there are plenty of snacks still available, so please save me from myself. Thank you very much.